Your alarm goes off at 7. You hear it. You know exactly what it means, what you have to do today, who is waiting on you. And you don't move. Not because you're tired, you slept 9 hours. Not because you're lazy. 2 years ago, you were up at 6 without an alarm. You just lie there looking at the ceiling, and the distance between your body and the edge of the bed feels like a distance that cannot be crossed. If you have never felt that, it sounds like an excuse. If you have felt it, you know it isn't one. Here's what almost everyone gets wrong about depression. They think it's sadness turned up loud, a very bad mood that overstayed. But sadness isn't the core of it, and in a lot of cases, sadness isn't even there. The most reliable symptom in the whole disorder is something else entirely. Anhedonia. The things that used to feel good stop feeling like anything. Your favorite songs plays, and it's just noise arriving on schedule. Food tastes like texture. Someone you love walks into the room, and the part of you that was supposed to light up doesn't. Not pain. Flatness. More than 280 million people are living with this right now. The World Health Organization ranks depressive disorders among the leading causes of disability on the planet, ahead of illnesses you can actually see on a scan. And for something that common, we understand it startlingly badly. But we do know one thing for certain. It is not happening only in someone's thoughts. It leaves marks. In 1996, a psychiatrist named Yvette Chalene at Washington University in St. Louis ran a study that should be more famous than it is. She recruited women who had a history of recurrent major depression. Here's the important part. None of them were depressed at the time. They were well. They were working, functioning, indistinguishable from anyone else in the waiting room. Then she put them in a scanner and measured a small curled structure deep in the brain called the hippocampus, the part that builds memory and helps regulate stress. Their hippocampi were smaller, measurably, visibly smaller than the women who had never been depressed. And then she found the detail that changed the conversation. The more total days a woman had spent depressed and untreated across her life, the smaller it was. Not how sad she said she felt. How long the illness had been running. Depression was leaving a footprint in tissue. So why would that happen? The leading explanation runs through stress hormones. When you're under threat, your body floods with cortisol. That's useful for about 20 minutes. It's what gets you out of the road before the car hits you. But cortisol is a short-term tool being used as a permanent setting, and the hippocampus is unusually loaded with receptors for it. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford spent decades documenting what happens when that exposure never switches off. The branching connections between neurons retract. The cells stop growing new ones. The system that is supposed to shut the stress response down is the same system getting worn down by it, so the brake wears out while the accelerator stays pressed. Which means depression isn't only caused by stress, it becomes a machine for producing more of it. That's the part that is held up. Now here's where it falls apart. You have probably heard at some point in your life that depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. Not enough serotonin. Take a pill, top the serotonin back up, feel better. Millions of people were told exactly that by a doctor they trusted. It was on television. It was in the pamphlet. In 2022, a psychiatrist named Joanna Moncrief at University College London published an umbrella review in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. An umbrella review is a study of studies of studies, the highest level you can climb. Her team pulled together the major strands of serotonin research going back decades. Serotonin levels in the blood, serotonin receptors, genes for serotonin transport, studies where researchers artificially depleted serotonin in healthy volunteers to see if they would get depressed. The finding was blunt. There was no consistent evidence that depression is caused by low serotonin. The pushback was immediate, and it was loud. A lot of psychiatrists pointed out, correctly, that the serotonin story had been treated as a simplification inside the field for years, and that the public just never got the update. But that's sort of the problem, isn't it? The explanation nearly everyone was given for their own illness was the one the field had quietly stopped believing. Now, there's an obvious counterpoint here, and it's a serious one. If the serotonin story is wrong, do antidepressants even work? They do. In 2018, Andrea Cipriani at the University of Oxford led one of the largest analyses in the history of psychiatry, published in The Lancet. 522 double-blind trials, more than 116,000 patients, 21 different antidepressants. Every single one of them beat placebo. The effect sizes were mostly modest and they don't work for everyone, and that matters. But the drugs are not doing nothing. So we have medicines that help millions of people through a mechanism we cannot correctly describe. That's stranger than it sounds, but it isn't unprecedented. Aspirin sat in medicine cabinets for about 70 years before anyone worked out how it actually functions. Working and being understood are two different achievements. And here's where it gets strange again. In 2000, a team at Yale led by Robert Berman, John Crystal, and Dennis Charney tried something that on paper made no sense. They gave a small group of severely depressed patients a single, low dose of ketamine, an anesthetic that has nothing to do with serotonin. Standard antidepressants take 4 to 6 weeks to lift a mood, and everyone in the field had built their theories around that delay. Improvement showed up in 4 hours. 4 hours. in people who had been unwell for years. The study was tiny, 7 patients, and tiny studies deserve suspicion. But it has been replicated many times since, and in 2019, a close relative of the drug was approved by the Food and Drug Administration for treatment-resistant depression. Ketamine works on glutamate, an entirely different signaling system, and it appears to trigger a rapid regrowth of the exact connections that chronic stress strips away. The timeline nobody could explain got explained by throwing out the chemical everyone was looking at. And then there's the finding that suggests depression might not be one illness at all. Andrew Miller and Charles Raisin at Emory University noticed that a subset of depressed patients have elevated markers of inflammation in their blood, not infection, just an immune system running hot. So in 2013, they ran a trial using infliximab, a drug that blocks an inflammatory signal, on people whose depression had resisted everything else. Overall, it failed. No better than placebo. But when they split the patients by their baseline inflammation, the picture inverted. People with high inflammation improved on the drug. People with low inflammation did better on the sugar pill. Same diagnosis, same symptoms, opposite biology, opposite response. Which raises the possibility that depression is the name we have given to a room that several different diseases happen to be standing in. And genetics hasn't rescued us either. In 2003, there was a celebrated finding that a variant in a serotonin transporter gene made people vulnerable to depression after stressful life events. It was cited thousands of times. It was taught in classrooms. Then, in 2019, a team at the University of Colorado Boulder tested 18 of these famous candidate genes across samples of hundreds of thousands of people and found essentially nothing. Not a weak effect. Nothing. What the large studies find instead is over 100 genetic variants, each contributing a sliver so small it's useless on its own. There is no depression gene. There's a weather system. I want to tell you about one specific night, because the statistics don't survive contact with what this actually is. In 1985, the novelist William Styron flew to Paris to accept a major literary prize. He was 60. He had written one of the most acclaimed American novels of the century, and by the time he reached France, he had lost the ability to think in a straight line, to eat, to sleep, to recognize himself. He had stopped being able to write. That December, back home in Connecticut, on what he later called the worst night of his life, he sat up alone, watching a film. Somewhere in it, a passage of Brahms played, and the music went through him. He thought about the house he was sitting in, the voices that had filled it, the people who had been happy there. He went upstairs and woke his wife. The next day, he checked himself into a hospital. He was there for 7 weeks and he came out the other side. Styron lived another 21 years. He wrote a short book called Darkness Visible about what had happened to him, and it did something no clinical paper had managed. It handed millions of people the words for a thing they had been carrying silently. He complained memorably that depression was far too mild and bloodless a word for what it describes, a wimp of a word for a wolf of an illness. Here's the part that should bother you. According to work led by Ronald Kessler and Philip Wang at Harvard, the median delay between the onset of a mood disorder and the moment a person first asks for help runs to roughly 6 to 8 years. Not 6 to 8 weeks, years. And during those years, remember what Shailene found. The clock is running, so think about the people around you. Statistically, in any group of 20 adults, you are looking at someone who is currently in this. They came to work. They answered your email. They laughed at the right moment in the conversation because performing normal is a skill you develop fast when the alternative is explaining. If that's someone you know, there are things that help and things that don't. Don't compare it to your bad week. It's meant kindly, and it lands as a dismissal because what you're describing is a mood and what they have is an illness. And hearing the two treated as the same thing teaches them to feel guilty for not getting over something you got over. Do make the first step smaller. Depression specifically attacks initiation, the ability to start things, which is why telling someone they should call a therapist is useless, and telling them you found 3 who take their insurance and you'll sit there while they call the first one is not. And ask the direct question, the one everyone is afraid of. There is a persistent fear that asking someone whether they are having thoughts of suicide will plant the idea. It doesn't. Madeline Gould at Columbia University tested this directly in 2005, screening thousands of high school students and found no increase in distress or in suicidal thinking. Among the students most at risk, being asked seemed to help. The question doesn't create the thought, it just ends the isolation around it. Depression is the only major illness where we routinely expect the patient to diagnose themselves, advocate for themselves, and organize their own treatment, using the exact machinery the disease has disabled. Nobody hands a person with a broken leg a list of surgeons and tells them to be proactive. Your alarm goes off at 7. You hear it. You don't move. It isn't that you won't get up. It's that the part of the brain that makes getting up feel like it's worth something has gone quiet. And quiet organs are not character flaws. They're organs. And organs, given the right help and enough time, are one of the very few things in this world that can come back.